Welcome again to the Fall Lecture Series. My name is Robert Mangurian. I do some camp counseling here and teaching. And I would like, before I start here, I'd like to use this opportunity to thank the Lectures Committee, which is our second-year graduate studio. Some of the people, maybe all of the people in there, to thank them for putting together such a fabulous lecture series this fall and for keeping it together up to this point, and I assume for the rest of the semester. I also feel that you'll be in for a great treat tonight with the words of our lecture. Pipeline rupture spreading hot oil in Russian Arctic, 2 million gallon spill. The volume is 8 times the amount of the leak from the Exxon Valdez. A rupture pipeline in the Russian Arctic has spilled 2 million barrels of hot oil, soaking the fragile permafrost and posing potentially major environmental damage to the region, according to reports received by the Federal Department of Energy. An American oil industry representative said that the oil that has burst through the dam is flowing to the tributary of the Percora as being more than 3 feet deep, 6 to 7 miles long, and 14 yards wide. As for the pipeline, it is true there are lots of leaks, this is in quotes, but they are being repaired, said the official. It happens from time to time, some small spills. From what I know, it's been reported to the minister and measures are being taken, end quote. New York Times, Tuesday, October 25th, 1994. On one of my first days in Buffalo, when I was about to shift my living quarters from the motel room to my office and was busy tidying up the desk there, I found a stack of printed matter, obviously material directed to Paul Scharitz from a strange company by the name of OECD. In virtually every drawer I opened and on practically each shelf I inspected, I found further stacks of these papers. After a closer look at these papers, I was puzzled by a peculiar mixture of economic style and utopian vision. There was too much legal English, official jargon, and management methodics to be normal artistic correspondence. For normal business communication, on the other hand, the projects described were definitely too visionary, not commercial enough, and too extensive in their social and political implications. I wondered whether a company of that particular type could actually survive as an organization in the capitalist USA. Very soon I came to the conclusion that projects described in their papers must actually be of an artistic nature, and that was how I came across Peter Fend in 1984. Peter Weibel. Ocean Earth is one of the few business ventures that fully understands the importance of conceptual and earth art. Through its satellite monitoring, geographic and information awareness programs, it creates models of the world and its markets. Ocean Earth activities have profound implications for those who want to understand the emerging strategic markets and geopolitical battles of the future. Ocean Earth, since 1980, has challenged us to see the world as changeable, with redrawn boundaries, and to keep in mind more permanent questions such as ecology. It upsets our sense of what we believe are permanent lines on maps and replaces those imaginary, agreed-upon conventions with more durable and natural facts of our physical world. Despite what people might believe about nations and boundaries, there are material facts of earth and water which we all must deal with. Harold Rivkin. Ocean Earth was created as an instrument for realizing the ideas generated by germinal work sources such as Joseph Beuys, Robert Smithson, and Gordon Maida Clark. It was created in response to the sterile conditions for art manifest by the galleries, even those which had taken the lead in movements like Art Povera and commissioned outdoor work. Much blockage has been experienced, chiefly from vested interests using government institutions as protection. Some of this blockage can be attributed to the work done by Ocean Earth in mass media with observation satellites, which work revealed the systematically hidden secrets of regions like Iran, the Gulf, Libya, Lebanon, the Falklands, various Soviet military bases, and ecological catastrophes like the North Sea algae explosion of 1988. But probably a more serious and chronic blockage has come from the art world itself. Peter Fend.
Thank you. I'll try to have this become a roaming session a bit, as I think what I'll start with is by sort of indicating what's on the wall so you get a bit of an orientation. I'll also note that the man quoted, Harold Rifkin, appears frequently in the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal as a businessman. He's also an expert on Russia, and it would be quite interesting to see if he could bring some of these ideas to the attention of the Russian authorities. Another thing that maybe would be very important here to the audience, I will always be referring to a sort of other world. I don't mean an imaginary world, a visionary world. I mean sort of the East, because most everything that I have learned about from the Western art has been also practiced or developed in some sense by the Eastern world. I mean that the Eastern Russia, Eastern Europe, and so on. And it's been quite exciting to find out that art is never alone. Maybe a way for you all here in the architecture school to get a grasp of this, I would say that the sources of much of the thinking, even farther back from the art sources like Joseph Beuys and so on, is listed here below. I don't know if you can read that, but I just named some artists who are critical to the idea base for what's going on. The sources are also, I'll just write it here, Alberti, Sant'Elia, and Scully, very conventional people, well, very authoritative. The point of Alberti being that the architectural question isn't so much buildings, but the city, and the problems of the city are, and he enumerated these: 1, air; 2, water; and 3, room in which to move, some kind of space for physical pleasure. And then the point of Sant'Elia being the necessity of working with dynamics. He, along with Marinetti, identifying the ocean as a center of power. That was in the some manifestos of him and Marinetti. And the point of Scully being that was really the point that triggered my career. Scully, in 1977, gave a series of lectures at Columbia, rather famous series, called Garden and Fortress, the Shape of France. And his thesis, using slides, we'll have slides here side by side, showing that the notion of the nation state is a aesthetic concept derived from the formal garden, the Renaissance cathedral, and the fortress that evolved at that time with the idea of shooting down straight alleyways. And one created a kind of rectilinear form, and one had a rectilinear idea of movement and space within which to work, and one could then radiate in a rectilinear way out from a center at, say, Versailles, to create the French state. And that, of course, in the 20th century has been heavily contested and has been more or less made absurd with the Missile Age. And Scully raised towards the end of his talk saying, well, what would be the implications of earth art, as this was a new idea of terrain? And I seized on that, and that night actually put together a whole sequence of earthworks that I was already knew about into a schedule that was then shown at Caltech in my first art show in 1978. Maybe to give you some sense of also a grasp of your careers and who I am and why I'm here, I had thought of going to architecture school. I was probably a bit older than you all here. I was I'm born in 1950, so when I was getting out of college in 1972, thereabouts, I was thinking, what do I do? I can learn from Michael Graves. I didn't want to be involved in postmodernist stuff. I didn't want to be involved in learning from Las Vegas. And so I really wanted to deal with more essential issues as I saw emerging the question of, can I even breathe in the city? Why do I live in a city at all if it's not habitable? So these, I was captivated by earth art at that time, just as Robert Smithson was sort of at the peak of his career. And after a couple of years of research and investigation and being actually in various libraries at the Giannini Library of Agriculture and the Yale Art Library and so on, I decided to plunge into the art world and dealt directly with leading artists. I just wrote them letters, said I think we should do something. And I got to know a number of the artists here listed and began to actually work with them, and then, well, so began the career. One point I want to emphasize too here is that I don't really think of what I'm doing as art. I think of what I'm doing as architecture, and I'm very, very happy indeed to be not giving an art talk and talking about all the, say, blockage of the art world and so on, or the conservatism of the power structures, but rather more addressing an audience that I think maybe can use this thinking and is prepared to do so. I was very impressed this afternoon coming by and meeting with some of the people from the committee and learning that they're thinking very similarly to the way I'm thinking in terms of people here are thinking similarly, for example, what to do with Southwest America in terms of the desert, the terrain, how to develop this area out here, this Playa Vista, I think it is. This kind of larger scale thinking, which I think is very important, and it revitalizes my own excitement when I first came to LA in 1978, when actually most of the architecture you're going to see here was kindled by the excitement I had with the city, with the freeways, and with going out to Pasadena and going up into the hills. After that, I did a performance called End of LA, which is really about how LA would transform itself radically as an urban environment and become a model for urban development. What I'm very excited by also is that we have a kind of historical context here. There was a bit of a chasing going on. Barcelona has been now being pushed forward with a number of diplomatic backings as the new model city, and then now they're trying to, this is also, you read this in the Financial Times and so on, we will have the new model of urban development coming out of Barcelona. Now, I don't know, really? And I think we also know that there's a very challenging situation in Asia, especially with China and India and so on. What will be the shape of urban development as we have a very challenging environmental and urban development task before us, what's going to go on there. And I think we're going to see as we go into this the possibilities of using the LA region as a model. And on the wall, now go through the wall and then we'll get into the slides shortly. On the wall is well, there's LA. The way I approach it is a very mundane way. If you've ever gone mountain climbing or gone hiking, you understand what a ridge is. And one side goes down the other side, to one ocean, and the other side goes to the other sea. And that's the slope from the high ridge down to what could be seen as the waters around LA, the LA Bay. And we're going from the Tijuana area up to Santa Barbara, and that forms a kind of arc. Now, why I use these kinds of maps all the time is that then I can compare things by scale very quickly. Comparably, you have Berlin to Hamburg up along the Danish coast, and that, of course, is receiving all the pollutants from the Elbe River. And you may know that nowadays there's big talk about building a magnetic train, a special kind of elevated train that's worse than a monorail between Hamburg and Berlin. That will be heavily contested in Germany now with the recent election. This area here is the same size as this, with the same arc. You see the kind of form. and it arcs up, and well, let's just say a very similar, very parallel site happens to be Albania, Montenegro, Dubrovnik, and that is precisely the area that I will be trying to parallel with LA, and we were actually going to show this in the Documenta 1992, but with the, well, let's just say it became quite clear we couldn't because of the war, but we want to plunge into that, and that be a, shall we say, a real destination we were trying to go towards, that anything we do here in LA, and we intend to do things, that, I mean, you know, we, Ocean Earth, would be also go to this area of the Adriatic, now a war zone, but hey, you know, we got invited there into a country called Montenegro, which, just as the war was about ready to break out, made its own little curious move. It created an ecological constitution, and it said that we was going to pursue ecology as a new form of management, leaving communism behind, but not going to capitalism, per se. And what was very interesting is that the president of Montenegro was going to then host a big art show with the head of the, this guy who was head of the Swedish Museum, a big guy, a rather famous curator. And that was going to, and from his own personal collection, was going to be work from Joseph Beuys and Robert Smithson. So here's a country where the head of state knows art quite well. I'll go into that more in detail as we go by. Over there, just as a diagram, is our so-called magic solution. It's just a way of moving from the oil industry into the ocean industry. And actually, that's pretty standard science. There are scientists at Caltech who know all about that, and it's going to happen in the next 20, 30 years. We'd like to be at the forefront of that in terms of having clean air, clean water, and being able to finance a new kind of city. I'll get to that map on the far right later on. It's basically a football field that's shaped like Europe. Okay. We can go with the slides. This is our action movie. Do I have to press buttons? Do I have the buttons? Sorry. Oh, yeah, right. Good. One brief aside. I don't know if you've read it. Mark Skiles apparently got cued in on the work I do with some articles that appeared in the magazine, Arts. Said, thinking big. I think we're going to find out that actually we don't really think big. We think smaller than the existing military-industrial system does, and that's actually what we're trying to do, is to scale things down, but make them actually work. Okay, I'm going to figure this out. I'm not sure I can hold a mic and do this. Maybe what I do is put this in the socket, and we'll go through the slides, because I've given the talk about everything. Cool. And we got forward. Good. Are we going? There we go, that's one. That we all know. This we're going to know in a second. Good. Okay. I gave a talk last night at the Art Center, and they said, boy, you're so utopian. So I decided, so I decided to change everything. This is a totally different presentation. I already wanted to do that anyway. This also is very different from the talk given about 4 days ago in Kassel. And let's just say that what we're going to do is start with the solution, so to speak. And I'll get into the problems pretty fast, don't worry. The solution is, well, there's a spiral jetty by Robert Smithson, and we all know that piece. The basic thesis I'm adopting is that if there is a great art piece, then why not have it done again and again and again? Why not have it be reified and manifest in the world as normal architecture? What are the architectural implications? If that is a landscape, what are you going to do about that elsewhere? And everybody here who's thinking about, say, Nevada or Arizona might wonder whether this kind of art thinking about terrain could be used and done as standard architectural practice. On the right is sort of what we're trying to achieve, which is not so much saving the species, but allowing them to become just normal. In this case, the higher animals, of course, the high predators, and have the ecosystem be that vigorous that we don't have to be thinking about the last species here or there, but thinking about the fact that lions and tigers, buffaloes and antelope are typical on the landscape that we have today. I want to emphasize one thing, that my career began when I was they wanted me to go to law school, so I tried to write an application to law school. I ended up writing an essay called Agriculture Ends, Art Takes Over. And the point was that agriculture, I said, was moribund and dangerous and destructive of the planet. We have to use ideas from art to replace it, and hence all the ideas from Joseph Beuys, et cetera. And that was, my point was that we could actually use art ideas to achieve the same things that cave art did, which is the symbology and the, shall we say, motivation to be able to have a hunting-gathering system with maybe some limited gardening systems close into cities, and leave most of the land essentially wild, possibly commercially so. Same with the ocean. Now, it's funny that other artists recognize this as very interesting. Art curators thought it was crazy. Now, in 1994, 18 years after I initially wrote the essay, The Economist has a major article regarding America saying that the emerging regional planning thought, this is from a regional planner at Rutgers, and there are many others, is that we should go back to wild systems. We should abandon agriculture on most of the terrain of the United States. That means the Great Plains should go back to buffalo and antelope. You should have these kind of animals just roaming around. Why not? And it actually also has been proven that this would support a population in North America of about 500 million people. We don't need to have farming. We don't need to have domestication of animals and plants as we have had, which have, as we, I think, are all aware, been destroying our entire life base. Now, let's see if I can get this thing to click. I'm going to try to find a technique here. Okay. I'm not alone. And this person here is a colleague who approached me in 1979, Japanese-American Taro Suzuki. This is his work. On the left is mine and yours, haha. Is that in focus? I can't tell from this angle. That's okay? And the point is that that's his observation about how the world works today, Persian Gulf, for example. And on the right is his more ambiental art. I actually think of him as kind of an architect in the sense that he deals with rooms as the subject of his work, and he illuminates in various ways and creates a kind of space. Taro came to me in 1979, a very hot summer day in New York. We were both stripped to the waist and walking down the street. He says, I think we should start an art air force. And my father had been in the Air Force, which was then the Army Air Force. I said with logic that, well, let's go to the next step, let's call it Space Force. And then we decided to create a thing called Space Force, and there was some other thing about having, well, let's just say that we then put that into this company, but Space Force was involved with the fantasy of having satellite monitoring of the world and making that available to the public. And we can say, to say this as a preface, the whole practice of civil satellite monitoring for broadcast television, for mass media, was pioneered by 7 or 8 artists, including this man Paul Scherris and myself, Taro Suzuki, a number of other artists from the United States and Germany. We as a team, and even now in Holland and right now in Amsterdam, are doing live satellite monitoring of, in this case, pollution outflows into the North Sea, whatever. And we have really led the way in the whole notion of mass media as, hey, let's look at the world from space, and that was Space Force. That art initiative, I'll just say, has been blocked by various covert activities, and there have been trials and everything else. You can't do it anymore, at least not for now, at least not in detail. You can't look at war zones and whatever. But I'll just say that in 1986 at the U.S. Congress, when I gave some testimony for the Office of Technology Assessment, one senator said, well, gee, it looks like there's really 2 interesting new companies on the media horizon today. One is CNN, and the other one is Ocean Earth. That was 1986, just before Iran-Contra went into full swing. Many of the seminal ideas on the left, I'll just give you a little bit of sense of what we're going to start to dip into Yugoslavia here. On the left is the work of Paul Scherris. It's hard to read, but I'll just say that those are film clips. He made them into kind of art pieces. The point is he inspired us with the notion of rapid sequencing of color. Our thing with satellite images was not to do it in photography, but to do it in video mainly, and to have it be rapidly sequenced, changing colors, so you can see all the various different views of a site with the image processing. And on the right is just a person who wants to make a movie. about ocean Earth and about his experiences. I put her in the picture because she is wearing black. She is in mourning. She is a Yugoslav. She wants to make a movie about the Yugoslavia War and about this idea. Behind her is a basin map that we've been sort of famous for doing. This is of Mongolia. The reason why Mongolia seems to be important is that, or what I should say, the reason why the basin map is important is that the first scientific support for the work in terms of the mapping that you will see was from the head of the United Nations Environment Program's Regional Seas Program. This is all in accordance with their jurisdictional mandate. That man's from Split, Croatia. She is from Belgrade, Serbia, whatever you want to call it. And her father and he were working together on helping to promote this idea. He got killed, the other guy got removed, and shows he's wearing black. Let's just say that it's been a little bit of a kind of interesting landscape where you have contesting views of what the future will be. The Milosevic government has wanted to have a kind of oil-based future. Let's just say that, to give you a little bit of background there, as you know, there's a lot of kind of curious games going on in Yugoslavia. Just shortly before Desert Storm, there was a major attempt to negotiate the whole question of Kuwait that was spearheaded by the head of the non-aligned movement. That means 108 countries worldwide. At the peace conference that was being attempted, there were 15 countries which were major oil producers in the Americas, in Asia, and in the Middle East. That conference was headed by Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia tried to play a big role in reapportioning world oil. Good luck. I'm trying to get this thing to really click here. Okay. So let's just say Space Force. Now we're going to have a little reality. People say I'm utopian. Our idea was to be honest, and I'm going to move through these rather quickly. I'll just say that on the image on the left is the official image of Chernobyl. On the right is our image of Chernobyl. You will see a red spot here. That was our discovery, and we then did a whole geological analysis and so on. This was published by the European Space Agency as the most authoritative. It was published by the Oxford University Press, published by the MIT Press, by the London Times, etc. But 5 agents from the German secret police told us that we were not qualified to do that work. 5 agents of the German secret police, we were working in Germany, came to us and said that we were not qualified to do this kind of work. I think a double irony is that the main reason they were doing so was to defend the nuclear industry in Germany, which had intentions of exporting its technology into Russia and so on. It turns out now this past spring that the nuclear industry, namely Siemens, has decided it's not possible. It's too difficult, and it's better to go to gas, which is, by the way, our proposal. So, hey, well, 8 years later, they come around to our point of view. On the left is our analysis more in detail of that spot. We were able to identify its architectural problem. I had the good fortune, is it good fortune? I had the good fortune of having some relatives who were in the German army in World War II, and they had been here so they could give me all the maps the way it used to be, and then I could see the difference. And I could confirm that, hey, you know, this is all artificial landfill. It's in the middle of a riverbed. It obviously has shifted with the flooding of that spring, 1986. It's a unstable site. By the way, you don't build in floodplains anyway, do you? And the point is that all those discoveries, which were then published, presented at environment conferences of the UN, of the FAO, and so on, and I sort of all the other things we got in terms of kudos, I guess it's correct stuff. All that stuff was, well, we had it registered at CIPA Press in Paris and was given to the media on a fairly regular basis. A couple of years ago, I was told by somebody to meet him at a Paris train station, and he said, well, you're going to have a little trouble here. I said, I know we're having some trouble. Well, it turned out that the French police took all these satellite photographs away, replaced them with the kind of stuff you see on the right, which is much less meaningful of what's going on here, and then put our name on it. Fortunately, we had other masters in Milan. I'm trying to get this thing to click. There we go. The kind of discovery they were doing when I was told I was not qualified was over there, where we identified the oil slick being laid down just upstream from the Chernobyl reactor site. And on the right is some French satellite data just allowing us to analyze the construction of all kinds of new concrete along the river track, the deep point of the river trough. I'll just point this out. All the white spots that you're going to see along the line are the reactor spot, and these are all added to the site. And we were then publishing in 1989 that this would not probably be very stable over a period of, well, the recommended life of 100 years. And in fact, at the International Atomic Energy Agency this past spring, it was said that this is not stable. The concrete is breaking up. I got to close down the site. In London, a plan was presented for what to do with it, and these are elements of the plan that was taken out of the show the day after the show opened. On grounds that, well, too controversial. I'm not going to climb over to that. I'll just say that these images show the kind of thinking about what to do with the water system. Basically, we were together with some scientists from Monaco, and it was discussed that we would the best thing to do in terms of the radioactivity entering the Black Sea was to increase the salinity of the Black Sea, and that meant to break off a chip from the Black Sea basin and feed it into the Caspian basin, and that's sort of identified here with these maps here. There's also a plan to divert the whole Pripyat River over to another river that feeds in below the Kiev Reservoir. Attempts to show all this, as I said, in London were blocked. I don't know if that's going to be allowed sometime later on. Basically, if you operate in the art world, you're sort of being told that you don't want to upset collectors. Okay. This is the first art show in New York after the whole debacle of being blocked from doing any kind of activity. I mean by that where every broadcast TV company, every newspaper gets a letter saying thou shalt not buy anything from Ocean Earth or Peter Fend and so on, and then you have these trials, etc. Okay, the point is that this is our analysis of the Persian Gulf up to about the time of Iran-Contra, and I'll just say that you'll see a kind of shape. I guess I'll try to identify it. Let's say, first of all, as everybody is thinking about architecture, the area covered here is about the same size as greater New York City. On the lower left would be, say, Brunswick, and on the upper right would be Stamford. So you're talking about a delta formation, a river formation, about the same thing as the Hudson River feeding into the New York Bight. Now, on the left is as of about 1980, and on the right is what was pretty much under construction by, guess who? The Russians, the other side of the equation, using ideas basically identical to those of American Earth artists like Michael Heitzer, Dennis Oppenheim, and Robert Smithson. What was very exciting is I could sit in a Paris cafe and show some satellite photographs from, say, 1982, early in the construction stage. We were monitoring this from 1980 to 1986, 1987 actually. And I could show some photographs and say, oh, that's a Michael Heitzer, which is about 5 meters long. And I say, no, that's actually a satellite photograph of something which is about 25 kilometers long. And, well, same thing, same look, same feel, same aesthetic, but it's done by the Russians, not by the Americans. Which is more or less to the point that if you think that you're unique, maybe you are, but it's very, very important to keep pursuing your ideas and go for it and keep advancing and not be intimidated by various conservative forces, because, frankly, if you're going to be blocked, then maybe the Japanese would do it, maybe the Russians would do it. Someone's going to do it. Now, this has been blocked temporarily, but as you all know, there's a lot of intrigue now in the Persian Gulf because more or less the main beneficiary of Desert Storm will probably be Russia. That's emerging in the news that, well, hey, guess what? When the embargo ends and when the other prohibitions end, the big concessions will all be awarded to Russian companies because, after all, they're no longer communists, right? So we have to be friendly with them, right? Well, I guess so. And that means that the West loses the #2 oil resource in the world. Very nice. Okay, but maybe just as well. Now, I sort of, just to identify the shapes roughly, what we were seeing was the infrastructure of all this itself to affect the entire river here, and over there on the left, the Euphrates River. The elite yards nowadays are actually not part of this river system, and I would say that they pretty much want to enforce that.
Yeah, that's the pointer. Just push the clip.
Essential, I don't think. Do you see that basically the two lines there? See that line over there? Is that working now?
See the red light.
Okay, wait, red light. Press here. What? Oh, sorry. Do I press something? There we go. I see it. Okay. Very good. I'll see if I can get that angle there. Okay. Right now. So anyway, the point is the construction work was going to form this kind of curvilinear form going through what is now this backed up salt marsh area, which is always evaporating, losing about 90% of the water volume of the Tigris-Euphrates and causing a lot of desiccation and allow the rivers to flow freely and to restore, I don't know if they meant this, but it would restore the vitality of the Persian Gulf. We'll see this now in more images. Okay. If I can get this going, there we go. What we do is the work on the left is the Iraqi construction with Russian engineering of what we call multi-channel canal. This is produced with French satellite data. When we got the data, well, we ordered the data, we made a contract. Suddenly the data never arrived. I knew that the data was available in Sweden, so I got it from Sweden and then began the chasing. I couldn't go back into France for about several months, and until we got on the media, at least. And on the right is a work of identical idea, which is a multi-channel canal modeled but never built by Dennis Oppenheim. The year of the work on the left is 1986. The year of the work on the right is 1966. On the left is also work by Dennis Oppenheim. The concept is how to build a river system or a trench that would go to the sea. The whole idea is to build earthworks reaching the sea. On the right is, in fact, what they did, or at least what they tried to do until they were stopped by the military actions of late 86, early 87, which was basically Iran-Contra Fed. That is to say, there was a very substantial U.S. covert presence in that. And let's see. On the left is our analysis of what to do. Now, here's where it happens. You see all this stuff. You see your news articles being kind of changed. You see the broadcast coming out false. You get a little frustrated. In fact, you don't feel very safe. So what you do is you go to, actually we went to the United Nations starting in 1985, began negotiations with the negotiators between Iran and Iraq, began supplying satellite data and so on. And then we began to say, hey, actually this all is like art. And this was shown to a number of artists, including one we have a contract with, Dennis Oppenheim, and we sort of decided to go ahead and to make our scenario about how to proceed, even though all this has been blocked by the military actions, as they say. And we were saying, gee, we identify this as a worthwhile construction. We don't really care who the hell does it. Let's just go ahead and go for it. On the right is a model as prepared and produced in Vienna. I have to say that it's really nice to have many countries in Europe because you can always find some place where you're not going to be blocked from doing this kind of work. On the left, you have sort of a scenario of how this whole thing works in terms of restoring the Garden of Eden or that whole kind of fertility area. It's a convergence of 4 rivers, and the main structure to really notice here is not so much what I showed, this multi-channel canal, but the thing coming from the left, which is, if I can get this, there we go, this line here, that is part of the Jorditic pattern of the main river of Saudi Arabia. And, it's very funny. Now there are 30,000 soldiers from the west in that area guarding the border between between Iraq and Kuwait. And actually the border is right here in this zone where that river comes in. We think they should build a very nice barrier called a new river flow. It's now a dead river flow. It's all buried under lots of sand. They got plenty of artillery. Hey, just dig it out. And that's been our proposal. We presented that at the UN press conference in 1991. We didn't have any models, but you're going to see some now. I think. Yeah, we're just going to see some models of what we propose. This would be one model we propose now too. We didn't have that then, we have this now. This is a very large model for what to do with the Karun River, the main river affected by that multi-channel canal, and that is to revitalize the river, this #1 river of Iran, by building these kind of large spiral structures up in the hills rather than building a huge dam. Now, we say that with some urgency. See, everything we're doing is kind of real time or historical time based. There has been a major initiative since the 1992 Rio conference by the German, by some German construction companies to work with a Brazilian construction company, Rio, and to build a very, very large dam in Iran, become friendly with the Iranians and so on. The problem is it will probably, the World Bank refused to fund that project on grounds that it was not going to be good for the Gulf or for the whole Iran-Iraq area, and it would just not be good for the environment generally. And no one's come up with an alternative scenario. This alternative was presented using, as on the left slab, the whole model of the Karun River, and then this is more of a detailed shot using some sections of mountain that are following this kind of vocabulary of basically double spiral systems using a combination of works by, oh God knows, I can list about 5 artists, and putting into kind of an architectural schedule. It replaces dams. It allows marshes to be built up to control rivers more effectively than dams would. And that's a more detailed shot of the kind of thing being done, which is to essentially use, in this case, the works of about, let's see, we have 2 or 3 artists here, to begin to restore a playa to a freshwater system and to be able to allow that to be integrated into kind of a series of marshes. I won't go into detail on these things, it gets kind of technical. I see we've lost that slide there a bit. That is, let's just say that image on the left is a model that we have shown now in London. That's one thing that didn't get taken out of the show, of what to do with the, this is the main river of Saudi Arabia, a dead river, how to revive that river, and that was a multi-channel canal, about 100 kilometers long, with 3 channels and a number of sluices along the way, and that's our proposal. Now, a company called Morgan Stanley, you hear of them? Big investment company. They have been interested, well, they were getting a dossier, they've met, they want to see more stuff, and they might actually want to buy this work and some other works that I'll show you. The condition would be that it would be sold secretly in the sense that they would, I guess I can say that. That is to say, it would not be in the art magazines, it would not be in the art market, it would not be in museums, it would be for their own work in terms of trying to sell large projects. Why is that changing? You're changing it? Well, it doesn't really, you get the idea as a big kind of Etong stone type model of a river system. Now the right is the outlet of that, which is to say that we're going to develop spiral structures or tilted or sloped marshes to allow for the mixing of salt and fresh waters, which is critical to restoring terrain. Flying over here, you've all flown east-west now. I mean, when you fly across the western United States, and you see all this alluvial, more or less dead terrain, and you wonder, what can be done about that? And I think it's very important to see that some artists got into that and began to identify at least some kind of strategies for construction, for restoring that. This is what we're just elaborating more. There's a lot of scientific work, and the kind of papers that were mentioned earlier that I kind of floated around with, well, it's a lot of work in a lot of libraries and meeting a lot of scientists, actually. Meeting a lot of hydrologists, to try to flesh out the artistic idea into more architectural reality. Now, what that means in terms of Iran, in terms of the whole area, Iran, Iraq, and so on, is this thing. This was a map presented at the UN. We gave two press conferences at the UN. The second one was invited by the Turks, and understandably, this is like helping them revive their empire, I guess. Anyway, and this map was shown there with the idea of what to do with the Persian Gulf area. And on the right is a more kind of artistic presentation. It also shows what to do with the Dead Sea area or Palestine. As you know, today there was a treaty signed between Jordan and Israel. That area is immediately adjacent to this area, and is here marked in the orange. That whole thing is the whole basin of the Jordan River. And well, you know, we presented this at a Palestine conference that the UN did in 1987, I guess. And you know, you learn that you do it, but then nothing happens, and because frankly, nobody cares about art. You know, they think, oh, it's a crazy idea. But let's just say, is in reserve, is standing by, and we're aware that there is a basin, the Jordan River Basin, there is a Dead Sea Basin as a result that is going to have to be dealt with in terms of water. And it's very interesting that some of the people that we dealt with, some of the newspaper people we dealt with, like Bernard Traynor of the New York Times, has endorsed our work largely because he says, well, not only do you get high resolution, things like that, where you really, you can see everything, but also, and it's very useful to them, but also we've identified that water, not oil, is going to be the main issue in the Middle East. In fact, may become a main issue in the world. What we do, or could be done in the southwestern United States, and for that matter, relative to Los Angeles in terms of water supply, could very easily be applied to Persia, to Saudi Arabia, and so on. And that was very exciting. Questions? Everything not clear, I hope? I mean, you know, so much stuff. So we'll just kind of go through it. Essentially what happened is that we then identified water basins of the whole Middle East, that's sort of indicated on the left, and tied it in with the engineering work that was really monstrous stuff. You know, we're talking about $5 to $8 billion of construction work going on, again, in a war zone with a lot of people being shot and killed and otherwise mined or whatever in that area. Quite epic. And good stuff for an action movie. And on the right is the kind of the scheme as applied to the whole of Africa and Europe. This kind of mapping has been seen as political. I think that it's just, hey, looking at physical units, water units, land units, and realizing that there is an integrity due to gravity. Now, I'll get on to the next, shall we say, positive thing, and this is where I guess the action movie gets active. On the left is a diagram that was developed in 1976 or 77 by me, which I got these ideas from Joseph Beuys, actually, in his performances about Fat Corner, and I figured out, given Fat Corner always being a methane phase of the economy, that you could build an economy with a perpetual cycling through hydrocarbons, or in effect methane, and then you could deal with CO2, O2, CH4, degradation, regradation, in a kind of cycle. What was very exciting is that in about that same time, in the New York Times, appeared an article about a scientist in Illinois who was getting recognized for his theories on the structure of archaebacteria activity, as say anything that would degrade and then upgrade between CO2, O2, and CH4. That is to say, between methane and then what animals and plants do, breathing and exchanging CO2 and O2, oxygen and carbon dioxide. And well, great, here we have a scientific activity and we have an art-based activity, and they are operating in parallel. I then applied this to, shall we say, in this case, Milan, and to some place called Gat in Libya, and to say we could deal within a basin to have a cycling from the animal-plant exchange down to methane, then down to the ocean where you have, again, animal-plant, then back up and back and forth through the waste cycle and then back up through the growth cycle of, I proposed, giant plants in the sea, because that's the main reservoir of fertility and so on. And that was actually the point shown on the right. The derivative was, and this is confirmed by scientists at MIT and at Caltech, which explains largely why there was that first show at Caltech, would be that we base our energy system in the ocean, also in line with writings by Marinetti, and we recognize that the carbon can be captured or trapped and then degraded to CH4 through giant algae or giant plants. You might call them Jurassic plants. It's like a Jurassic Park, I guess. Very big plants. We're talking about returning to a kind of pre-modern, pre-Neolithic situation of having plants about 150 meters long. Now, all that research has been done in the Los Angeles area. That's why I'm glad to be here. It was initially sponsored by the United States Navy and by General Electric, U.S. Department of Energy, and then at a certain critical time in the late 70s, it was stopped. Now, just to give you a little sense of the drama here, when I came to Los Angeles in 1980 with, Jenny Holzer, Richard Prince, and then some other artists, maybe not as famous, Robin Winters, Colleen Fitzgibbon. We all came as a kind of group of artists working as the predecessor group to Ocean Earth, and we came to LA. We were invited here to do some shows, and we were then asked quite urgently by some scientists at Caltech would we please try to find a way of promoting their work in developing new energy sources from the ocean, new plant vegetation sources that are essentially solar, notwithstanding other forms of solar energy, but at least that would be a way of getting hydrocarbons, which you need for the steel industry, which you probably need for airplanes and so on. And it would be non-polluting clean air and all that, because all the federal funding was getting cut off, and because all the backing from the oil companies was not appearing. There was no support. And, well, that was 1980. We as a group sort of more or less fell apart, and it was not that popular. We really couldn't sustain that effort, and historically the fact is that as of about 1980, the whole research effort came to a grinding halt. And then in 1990, when Jenny Holzer was recommended, this is about the art world, was presented at the Venice Biennale as the world's greatest artist and so on that day, the International Herald Tribune had a headline saying that the new warning from the United Nations Commission on Global Warming says that there must be a cutback in fossil fuels by 60% now or else. That was 1990. And the irony was that the day that Jenny Holzer was, in this case alone as a great artist, so-called, presenting her work, was 10 years after the time that when she was with other artists and we were working together, they were asked to help to prevent this headline from ever happening. And it raises major questions about why the art world, which is motivation to creating single art stars here and there, Andy Warhol, Jenny Holzer, whatever, atomizing, splitting up the artists, making them ineffective, has been able to prevent the ability of in this case, the American Pavilion, having anything that was really more timely, given that our will had been to deal with that question, that request by the scientists to find a way of propagandizing a change in the fuel base from fossil fuels to renewable. And, well, hey, guess what? Now, the funny thing is, just to give you some sense of the urgency and why I'm here also in LA to get to meet these scientists again, see what we can do to kickstart the whole operation, is that at the Rio conference in 1992, after a lot of lobbying pressure, the United States and so on finally agreed, okay, we'll cut back fossil fuel emissions by 10% by the year 2005. And the fact is that last year emissions went up 5%. Now, they didn't go back down 10%, it went up 5%. There will be a conference in March in Berlin, the same group, to try to say, okay, we'll kind of cut back 20%. Well, good luck. I think the point is we have to have more radical solutions, hence the action film. No one's really talking about doing this kind of scheme, which is the building of a rig. Now, on the left is an early drawing, and essentially ideas were taken from Vito Conchi and from Dennis Oppenheim to achieve the structure on the right, which is a bottom harvesting system as well as a top harvesting system. This means you double the rate of production, and you allow for constantly undermining the system. All this work is sponsored by the Ministry of Culture in France, which is basically trying to have revenge against, I guess, the British Admiralty, which is prohibiting any such research at the present time. So we just do it as culture, and we avoid science, but we work with scientists kind of, if you will, covertly. That's a surface idea of the models. Worked with a number of naval architects in terms of having I won't go into detail. Let's just say we worked out a kind of buoy system that's very elastic and flexible, and then we have some kind of anchoring system that helps maintain stability below. These are two parts of a show in France. And then we have subterranean monitoring to identify seafloors. We have supraterranean monitoring, in this case with the some Swiss scientists, to identify snowmelt and to identify how terrain is going to influence the sea in terms of its fertility. And then this is something we've done now as a co-copy with French scientists called Météo France. You see the image there. Basically what we've done. Okay, people always say that the basin maps are political. Well, hey, French scientists, and in fact many scientists find it to be just very normal. And what we've done here is to retrofit satellite data, which is normally in a square, comes in every 4 hours to conform with the basin idea. The problem is that it costs them another $10,000 to get the land to start being color active as well, because it involves different algorithms, different mathematics. And I guess what we're really trying to say here is that let's just say there's two expressions of kind of artistic of the same scientific idea. On the left is some kind of identification of the Iberian current, is that right? Yeah. And sites that we are singling out right now along that whole line of that satellite image. Let's see if we get the satellite image back again. There we go. That is now manifested here as this image bearing current. And the implications for France is that France is sort of cut up. This is a washbowl of an operating room. Is cut up, and the patient is broken up into 4 parts, and those are the new survivors, the ocean basin systems. Now, the French government has a kind of curious back and forth feeling about what I'm doing. They sort of decided to allow it to happen. And that's why a lot of work is being funded by them, although they don't want it to go too fast. Here's a French text, building a corridor of power along the Atlantic Ocean, and then it says begin to build. What do you build? You build the offshore energy system. This is some satellite monitoring of the Falklands. I'm sorry I don't have, the book shows better. Let's just say we've identified giant kelp down there. Now it's funny that the British, I'm not trying to attack the British, I'll just say that the British government, which wants the Falklands, is promoting the idea of oil industry. The fact is that you could have a huge kelp industry down there, and well, you know, we're going to try to promote that. Okay, that's just kind of a way of doing satellite monitoring, we think, in a kind of multi-monitor schedule, and then there would be one area to do it. This is Haiti on the right. What's curious about the Haiti model is that Haiti is probably the only country that I know of which is both a oceanic basin and a nation state, so that you actually have a kind of closed ecosystem that's also a country. I don't think Bill Clinton knows that yet, and it's kind of funny, because the way this was actually found out was that you'll see it later, but I think it's coming up, next image. Yeah, that map was prepared for the Yugoslav scientist who was head of the UN Environment Program. I must emphasize that all this logic comes out of the lecture by Vincent Scully, and just taking a book like Jack Burton's Great Western Salt Works and his analysis of Marcel Duchamp, and you go, well, gee, let's look at ocean basins. So all you do is you find an ocean, and you look at all the land going into it, and you map it out, bang. And you get some very interesting discoveries. In this case, what had happened is that you go to cocktail parties in New York and talk to this and that person, and basically you end up meeting this head of the UN Environment Program office in New York, and he said, well, what can you do about the Caribbean? And I go back, do some analysis, and say, well, there's the map. That's actually the first map produced, 1982. And I say that you should include the Amazon in the system. And the reason why is because when we did some work with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute for a client, you identify that, hey, look at the Amazon. The Amazon basically is mostly the mountains. This is obviously exaggerated, but it's the profile of the basin. And then you have just passages through Brazil. The thing is that having identified that whole corridor from the Amazon through the Caribbean into the basin of the Gulf of Mexico and all the land draining into the Gulf of Mexico, do you recognize that? Is that readable? It's really from the Amazon through the Caribbean to the Gulf of Mexico, and then feeding out at the far right into the Gulf Stream. I'll indicate that. There's the Gulf Stream going out, and here's the Amazon going into the sea, then curving up into the Caribbean, into the Gulf of Mexico. There's Minneapolis up there and that kind of stuff. And then the waters are spinning out here. The point being that we also did a lot of satellite monitoring showing that all the cloud formation here goes to there, and then goes to Europe. And, well, let's just say that, and here's a bit of the drama. In 1992, at the Rio Ecological Conference, I was invited to be part of a big show called Art Amazonas. Here's some Amazon stuff. I was invited as an individual, not as part of a company. I said, first of all, we already have a track record as a company. I don't think we can do something. I don't think I can do something as an individual. Second of all, as I learned later from a BBC contact that we've developed over time, it turns out that Rio conference was used as an excuse, and that whole art show, which was sponsored by the German government, was used as an excuse by the German government to put money into building a huge nuclear reactor complex on the Amazon River itself, at a site called Sliding Stones. And it's called Sliding Stones because it's one of the few areas where there's any kind of bedrock that comes out of the mud. The problem is that as it's sliding stones, it might slip, and then you might have a problem with the nuclear reactor, meaning that all the radioactive clouds might go up this way and it might actually go to Europe, and so you're kind of committing kind of suicide. The irony here is that, and I'll just say that there is a kind of ongoing battle with the German foreign ministry here, because they're always trying to have a major role in world culture and world art. For example, right now they're arranging for a big conference in Sydney that will lead up to the year 2000 every year, where during the Olympics in Sydney, never mind they didn't do it in Berlin, who cares, there will be a big presentation of what the new art is, the new high technology art. This will be sponsored by the Goethe Institute. The Goethe Institute is a complete subsidiary of the Foreign Ministry. The head of the Foreign Ministry used to be the head of the secret police. I think they have their strategy. The strategy is very simple. The environmental ministry in Germany is also the nuclear ministry. So they want the nuclear fuels in Tibet or in Australia or in Brazil, and that's their idea of what the next energy future will be. It'll be nuclear. I don't happen to agree, but they want to then have big shows like Arte Amazonas that I was invited to justify nuclear power as what they think to be the solution to the energy problems of today. Sorry, guys. That will explain why I will be in Sydney in the coming months. Now, to basically head them off. And I talked to friends. Some Italian fields, and we've been talking with the Italian oil company about helping to sponsor this kind of research or the implications of it, because they could do it all along the coast of Labrador. That's their property, as indicated up around Labrador and Greenland. Now, the right is a site that we've already got a contract to work to get to find a site in New Zealand, and it's just mapping New Zealand, and I'll give you more close-ups of that. Trying to go down into that area down close where we will do, we have a 5-year contract to find a site. There are also 5-year contracts of the same nature in Iceland. There's an emerging contract in Tenerife. We'll see what happens. The main thing is to find a site, get going, using that framework of this corridor of the whole Atlantic Ocean from Australia, New Zealand, around the Antarctic, then through to the Arctic Ocean and back. It's the main world pump. Includes Haiti, of course, includes the Iberian Current. The problem is that the British Admiralty has made anything in the Northern Hemisphere, with the exception of Los Angeles area, illegal for this kind of research. That's why I'm here. It has to do with the history of the algae and so on. I won't bore you with the details. Now, the reason why there's a bit of urgency is, just to give an example of how science can be wrong-headed, I think. You may have heard there was a recent space shuttle, where they were doing a lot of radar observation, improving. They could find oil slicks and so on. I mean, hey, we know about oil. I think we've already had a good introduction here about the problems of oil. We know that oil is toxic, and you look at the air around LA, come on. Why look for oil slicks? Let's look for something commercial. And how are we going to do that? Not with radar data that's very precise, but with much cruder data that you get every 4 hours. This is what we're working on right now in this show in Holland. And that data, the reason why I'm showing these now, that these are rather famous images. They led to one presentation at a UN Environment Conference, and also, well, quite funny story. I was in Holland at the time, actually. There was an algae bloom, this explosion you heard about, and then we rushed off to get all the data. We processed it in Kiel in Germany, and you see this kind of big kind of greenish hue around Denmark. Sorry about the color, but you see the discoloration around Denmark. On the right, that discoloration is much smaller on the left. That change is only 24 hours. So it means that a catastrophe, because all those areas discolored are where all the fish are dying. I mean, they all just got wiped out totally. There was an archibacterial breakdown of the whole ecosystem. It was a complete collapse of the oxygen-producing capacity in the water. It shows that an ecological catastrophe is very, very fast, and actually is pan-geographic. It kind of implied that if there were to be such a disaster, possibly say around the Black Sea, it actually would go very, very quickly. It's not like you get a slow death, you get a pretty fast death, and pretty total, because the whole chemistry changes. The German scientist we worked with in Kiel was so excited by this material, he drove down to the environmental ministry in Bonn with him his stuff to have it be broadcast on television, etc. We said, okay, fine, go, good luck. And the government said, don't cause a panic. Forget it. So we got this published in Denmark. And later in the art magazines. The implications were that we could identify essentially sources of pollution. For example, that map on the right, which is Switzerland. Are there Swiss people in the audience, I heard? That's everything up to Basel. That contributes 65% of the water and pollutants, well, water and material, I should say, of the Rhine, just that alone, that upper part of the watershed. On the left is a demarcation into parts of the Gulf Stream estuary as it flows into Europe, and one is the North Sea basin, and the other one is the Irish Sea with the English Channel. And we do this kind of mapping. People say it's political. I just say it was funny because when we had this broadcast on CBS News, digitized and changed a bit, but I mean they said, oh, that's the architecture of Prince Charles. And that was quite serious. They said because Prince Charles was at that time crusading for a North Sea administration or some kind of way of solving the North Sea's problems. Well, there it is. You have a whole basin of the North Sea. It includes part of France, part of Germany, and part of Switzerland and so on. That's the concavity, and that's, if you want to look at an algae bloom or some other kind of trouble, you look at the whole area and see what's making that happen. Bear in mind again that the only person really endorsing this officially was a Yugoslavian scientist. Oh, I'm sorry, then later a Swedish scientist, quite famous hydrologist from Sweden, but at least about that time, just a Yugoslav guy. Now, I guess, I don't know if you like this stuff. This is architecture planning for the conjunction of the Ruhr and the Rhine, and it was just to have the city be pretty much removed and replaced by the kind of archiogram elevated structures, so that was sort of indicated on the left, and then to allow for marshes to replace where all the steel mills and all the dumping grounds are. So that was just two different versions of what to do with Duisberg. Now when that was shown, or rather when there was a show that did something like this for New York in 1980, Joseph Beuys saw it, and I was invited to then do something like this for Germany, and that led to a show called Ruhrgebiet in Germany. Beuys, of course, Fend, Carnap. Who's Carnap? I forget who he is, but Haus Rücker, they're quite famous. And the point is that this show was an attempt, well, I was invited, that's how I began to be involved in Germany, actually. Let's just say that is the basis for some articles that appear in the Frankfurt, the big newspaper, the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung and so on, and this all, Save the World Art and everything. But the question is, who's going to take the initiative? And what's very funny is that now we have a very delicate balance in Germany because the Chancellor, maybe Chancellor, Helmut Kohl, has a very, very minor majority, and some leading politicians in the opposition party, the SPD, have been advocating a basing of the economy as quickly as possible on what they call Pflanzenergie. It means plant energy, plant power. They're talking about things like sugarcane and primarily algae in the ocean. So it's good to know that there are political forces in Germany which don't believe in the nuclear option and which basically have subscribed to this kind of thing. The other part of the fat corner concept was to have an upgrading from urban waste into something that you could add to the environment. I'll just say that, just roughly speaking, on the left is a way of growing bacteria on hydrocarbons, and on the right is the production of these bacteria into various crystals and so on, various forms. And then on the left is I don't have it here, but I'll just say there's a feather, you produce feathers, there's a sequence of industrial events, and we have yet to get to it, but all these ideas come from artists, I have to say to you. Everything is simply art made scientific. You deposit feathers on the terrain, you identify the creation of a certain kind of force fields and so on as the terrain is fertilized. That's a Solo-Witt version. You see the clustering of the birds, which is with the radar scope, and you do this along flight lines, which are identified here in the Mediterranean basin. The flight lines, for example, are derived from works of Hans Hacke and of Dennis Oppenheim. The radar scoping is based on, actually a number of artists working with radar systems, and they say, well, fine, I did this in Graz. Austria, as they say, has been a major backer of this kind of work. Now, this kind of thinking, remember that you saw that image there of the Mediterranean basin. This is in the Mediterranean basin. Again, news item. The news item was that the Aswan Dam is in big trouble. There has to be a replacement for it. What are you going to do? Well, after some research with some Egyptians, they said, well, I think the thing to do is to open up new river channels through the southern part of Sudan, where a lot of water evaporates. These are some models for what to do there. Those models, also being discussed with Morgan Stanley, are basic disinterpretations of Michael Heitzer. And you saw that drawing before, but this is just a further elaboration of that kind of thinking, where the marsh system that we would be trying to develop along near playas or wadis would be expanded into a combination here of Di Maria's lightning field, Agnes Dennis's spiral system, obviously Smithson's systems, Oppenheim systems. You put it together, also use some Matta-Clark ideas about breaking up the terrain below, and I'll show that right now, I think, or at least coming up. This is concretized into structures to be put on the land. Now, these are works, these are models for how to develop marshes in the desert, how to revive river systems and so on, and how to revive playas in dealing with aquifers, really. And these are based on co-copyright holding with other artists. This company will share copyright with artists to be able to make architecture out of that work. And the work in this case was presented to the Shah of Iran in 1978 by Hans Meyer, an art dealer in Dusseldorf, for the price tag of about $240,000. 6 major models, not these models here, but other models, the earlier art models, art-like models, very conceptual. They were to have been executed by the Iranian military. This is all real. They were to have been executed by the Iranian military in and around the ancient capital of Iran called Persepolis, which was also to have been the Shah's idea, the first UN environmental park. Now, the artist had no idea what, I mean, it's just like, oh, art. And the Persians, well, I guess, yeah, art, cultural exchange, sounded symbolic. I tried to make meaning out of this and say, well, I think maybe there's some kind of possibility architecturally in terms of working with the land and reviving the land as terrain. And, well, that began a lot of work in 1977 or 78 at the time of the, 77 actually it was, presenting this stuff to the Shah. As you know, there was well, the fact is that in 1978, the 25-year contract of the Western oil companies in Iran expired, and so there was this so-called revolution. It's just the end of the contract. And, well, in 1991, at the second UN press conference, when I began to talk about these works being possibly useful, and this shows you why maybe you have to do architecture, not art, and some of the political aspects kind of funny. The Iranian consular to the mission to the UN stood up and directly accused me of trying to extort $240,000. And shortly afterwards, then the UN officially had a loudspeaker saying that contrary to rumors, the UN Secretary General was not going to resign, et cetera, because we had had this big scandal and articles in the International Herald Tribune, and that's why we had the press conferences. Anyway, and the whole press conference kind of broke up with a lot of kind of dangerous kind of, get out of here because it's kind of a little too heavy. And I was being essentially accused of trying to extort money from Iran. Well, what I had done is that after the initial scandal had broken out, this is where it was revealed that all the satellite data we were giving to the UN was going to Iran but not to Iraq. And then they tried to frame me, so I then framed the guy who was doing it, and he had to lose his job, et cetera, and so kind of, news stories. Anyway, when all that was happening in 1987, and then we had the second press conference in 1991, the point is that I tried to say, dear Iran, we don't hate you, we actually like you. Here are some works that were presented by some artists to your government in 1977 before the revolution. Why not try to use them? Because, for example, and then I send these drawings, this is what you could do to revive your aquifer system using that kind of logic. Now that was already worked out with some hydrologists, in this case from Switzerland. We knew this seemed to be a fairly logical system. It's called dry wells. It's for restoring river flow around a playa. Now, I'm sorry to say that the very idea of an American, get that, talking about art to an Iranian with a price tag, extortion. So, and see, that's the whole gap. How do you go from art to reality? Well, I guess you have to go through architecture because it doesn't seem to work through press conferences. Anyway, on the left is sort of the idea, which is really just to create evapotranspiration to create clouds. That's an image by an artist, an earth artist. He just said, hey, that's what I want to achieve. And you can achieve that if you can build this thing on the right, a marsh. And that's Joseph Beuys' fantasy as well, not giant magnetic train trips, but actually big marshes. Okay, now just another idea about reality, and I'll say that this whole story is like a field of broken dreams. Because, see, when you do this kind of satellite work with the governments, with the TV companies and so on, then you got the governments on your tail, and you have big chase scenes all the time. There's never enough money. And also you find out your colleague, in this case a guy from Germany, begins to be sort of told by his government to like, hey, why don't you undermine this whole operation, et cetera. So you're having, and then you have trials and everything else. It gets kind of messy. And you lose all your financial records, and then you have to go to the tax court and explain that, hey guys, the U.S. District Court, I know we don't have any tax records for 4 years. They've all been confiscated by the German government. I'm sorry about that. And then they drop it for national security reasons. So you win 2 trials, so-called, and you lose one in Germany. What the hell? You kind of come out of this. At least you can't work anymore. But in all that time, there was this pending request. and which we cannot do because we're always having a kind of chase scene, to fly down to Algiers and meet with the Algerian Ministry of the Environment and the Algerian military to talk about building gigantic earthworks in Algiers to begin in Algeria to begin to restore the desert to savanna, because the obvious fantasy of people who are in the Sahara is to go back to some kind of pre-Neolithic situation of lots of animals. Now, how did that happen? Well, it so happened in 1984 in Paris when we were doing some stuff for French TV. We took all these satellite shots, as you saw, of the Persian Gulf, and met the Algerian ambassador, who was also the negotiator at that time between Iran and Iraq, and said, we met several times and so on. And then he comes back to us and says, it's astounding, and I have as a witness Gordon Maddox Clark's sister, who was with me at the time. I think you can use your satellite stuff to help revive the desert and to restore it to savannah. I think we can use that to essentially bring back the previous wilderness situation. And that's what I have been showing as art. And he was saying this, he didn't know about our art. He was saying this as a diplomat. So it's very funny in the whole world of diplomacy. On one hand, we had a very curious communication with the Algerian diplomat. On the other hand, we had a very, I would say, antagonistic situation with the Iranian. I might say that the UN right now, the in-house newspaper is publishing our interpretation of that. Maybe that'll be a different history in the near future. But these works here are the first 1994 presentation of an idea given to us in 1984, a request, would we please come up with a proposal for Algeria? As you know, Algeria now is on the verge of a war. But the work on the left is art. It's basically, in this case, Oppenheimer could be Heitzer, various ideas of building trench systems, water through flow systems that go through salt lake areas and keep water flowing. Now, the right is the prescription for a major desert area in Algeria, also taking in part of some interior, in the very far up in the rear, breaking through a whole new basin and feeding into this through flow, which goes to Tunisia, also that. And that model then, which would involve several, a lot of money, would be in this area indicated on the left, which is the eastern, I guess they call it the Erg Oriental. Anyway, the eastern desert of the Sahara, the eastern part of the Sahara before Libya. And it then flows into the Gulf of Jerba, and we're indicating how to do that, just work with this mixing of salt and fresh waters in this kind of diagram here. That diagram is from 1978, the model is from 1984, and the request of 1984, we're at a position now where we have to, take it to the Algerian government or get back to that guy in Paris or wherever he is now, I don't know. But it's this time lag is very frustrating because obviously the art world doesn't care. How do you go from a serious request by a government official to actually presenting that work seriously so it can be or some version of it can be built? And we think this is a plausible way to do it. Now, I'll just continue that. You saw the same model here. I'll just say that the way we began to talk with Morgan Stanley was involving China. The day of the opening of the show in London, which we then took to Morgan Stanley to have them review, the Wall Street Journal had a lead article saying, guess what, there's going to be maybe a huge dam on the Yangtze River, and that could be a huge disaster, and it might even cost a lot of money, like $70 billion. It would not generate much electricity. I think you're all aware here that China is more or less seen to be the next big power, and the problem is that they don't have enough energy. They don't have enough electrical power, just enough fuel power, whatever. And that's one reason why China, for example, is making territorial claims to the South China Sea. There's even been scenarios of a U.S.-Chinese war because of these grabbing aspects of Chinese policy, which are more or less necessary if it's going to become a power on these, with the same kind of richness or the same kind of wealth as the West has enjoyed. So China is expansive and wants more power. And we're saying, well, forget about that dam. Don't build that huge dam. And instead, a number of models were shown what to do in Tibet, what to do coming downstream, and what to do along the coast. And then here's a diagram of the coast. Also with that, if you see, once we've identified that part of Tibet can be a portion of China, not all of it, part of it, okay? We're not saying you can't have, we're making a kind of a sensitive statement. This part goes into the Yangtze and then goes out through the Yangtze as with this kind of construction near the outlet, as opposed to having dams and so on. And then obviously will influence fertility of the waters leading into Japan. let's just say that will be presented in Japan in March, and the question is who's going to put the money into it and all that kind of stuff. We're talking about maybe $20 billion as opposed to $70 billion, and people would say this megalomaniacal. I say it's thinking less big than what they're already thinking, and maybe thinking a bit slightly more practically in terms of the overall long-term energy needs of that area of China and Japan. Now, one of the implications is that southern China would become part of the South China Sea system, which is separate from the East China Sea system. You could call that a division. Actually, it's a rather famous cultural division. It's between Cantonese culture and Mandarin culture. Making these kind of statements is something where, well, I do that at the present time primarily through the French because they understand the diplomatic implications. I can't do that through the U.S. Now, over here is just some models of what to be built, the missile hailing systems, the offshore marsh systems, basically large generating systems for having maximum bioproductivity in the ocean, using the fact that the Yangtze is the biggest river in Asia. Okay, now we're going to go to where we have a bit more reality. I'll just say that the only country that ever took us seriously in terms of making contracts and getting us to a site and actually doing something was the former Yugoslavia, more precisely Montenegro, with a base in this case in Belgrade, but with collaborating architects and scientists from Croatia. God knows what the outcome is. Let's just say we're itching to get back in. We now do have some clearance from the U.S. government to go back in, but only through the French government. It's funny. I guess you can't go directly in through the U.S. I understand because I tend to think that the U.S. is, well, they're too geopolitically involved in, shall we say, making the war happen. Now, what we did is some guy from Bern, from the university there, read an article about us in the London Times, liked it, and I happened to be in Bern at the time. He made a proposal that we do satellite monitoring with him of the Adriatic as a standard annual service. This is the competing French proposal on the right. These are different ways of looking at the thing. I'm not going to make a statement, but to say that we're looking at various bids. Why? Because when a presentation was made in Venice to a UN conference, a UN Environment Program conference about the 21st century, I gave basically an art show with more text, same thing that was always been shown, just more detailed studies and some kind of writing. And I was approached by an Italian scientist, a rather prominent guy, who then introduced me to the chief architect of the city of Venice, who happened to also be the head of the Consorzio Venezia Nuova. And this man, well, it's very funny because I had read about him in the New York Times. He had been in charge with the responsibility of dealing with all those algae problems in the Adriatic Sea. And so he asked for a contract for us to do algae research and to do satellite monitoring. So what came out of that was the idea of doing it within a basin framework. And let's see what else we got here. Well, that's slightly later, but I'll just say that we ended up with a site. Well, the way it was like this. This negotiation went on for about 6 months. And like, well, what could you do? Well, we'll use our basin idea, ocean Earth, and identify the Adriatic Basin as a complete system. He liked that, very good. And we will do the satellite monitoring. He liked that, but he wanted a proposal first, and he was going to give us $14,000 for the proposal. And frankly, I decided, knowing Italian state bureaucracies, not to do that. I met with an Italian lawyer, and I took up his other proposal that he said, you should find a site in Yugoslavia because we need a partner. So we found a site in Yugoslavia over here, the site in Tivat Bay, Yugoslavia. That's written in German, I'm sorry to say. Anyway, the point is that we got all that together and we decided, well, look at Italy, a lot of corruption. Do we really want to get government support? I don't know. So we decided to publish it in Flash Art magazine instead. And, well, the decision was to jump for entry into, these are some other sites along that area, also in Trieste. We decided to jump into, we decided to jump into a parallel with Los Angeles. And to take on the whole Yugoslavia question lock, stock, and barrel, partly because we were told by some Western governments that they were very unhappy with our work in Yugoslavia. We actually had some run-ins with some guys from, well, several countries. And they sort of said, you really can't do this stuff in Yugoslavia. And they said, well, okay, it was a tough question. Do we go ahead, not go ahead? Here's cutting edge. We weren't quite sure. But we decided to deal with the Yugoslavia question by identifying the basins, the slopes of the country, and then we did, and you'll see this, we said, okay, well, let's do a parallel project, LA, and Albania, Montenegro, Dubrovnik. And these two shapes became the governing shapes for using that as a kind of guide, given that the only place in the Northern Hemisphere where this kind of work is allowed is California. This is the modeling of our whole parallel project scheme. Would be on the left the Adriatic here. This is the Adriatic, and this is the coast of California. And then you see the Southern California arc, and then the Albania Montenegro arc there. That's a model of the whole thing. And that's actually a geographical model of how it works. You have some curious, well, let's just say there's a lot of strange geography there. We were invited to go into this area, and we had, a little story about that. I pulled away a guy from Paul Rudolph, from the architectural firm of Paul Rudolph, to work on this project. Actually, he had heard me talk at Yale, and he said, I want to work with Ocean Earth. And I said, well, I think we got a project here because the governor of Montenegro and some architects in Belgrade wanted us to go ahead on what was, we found out later, a $500 million real estate development scheme of British money. Well, of course, it's on hold right now. But, we were going to, hey, I guess make a few $1 million. And the job we were entitled, we took a trip, as you can see on the left, and that bay, I'll just explain why we have the model on the right. About 2 months after we began the project, we had to leave the country, and the U.S. government said, you can't come back, blah, blah. So we made a model of the whole bay in the gallery in New York, and we began to do the work with the computer in the background with satellite data, drafting board, and actually trying to plan the region as we could not do it in reality, sort of a surrogation site. But this was, and then you have this, we call it a gallery transplant. Which is very art historically correct. There have been artists who've done this kind of work, conceptual artists, taking a site and putting it into a gallery and then trying to work on that site inside the gallery. And you see it's inhabited and so on, a lot of activity there. And then we put all the satellite data into digital form, into elevation format. We would fly through the whole thing. This is just scenes from our video of flying through the whole site. And that was all designed, and then we were also asked to tackle this problem, and we decided to help them develop a kind of spiral form of a through-flow water to allow for, to grow giant algae. The mandate we had, this is the scale models of the site, as now shown in Frankfurt, kind of ironic, because the main government really angry with us was the German government. But they called me a Kriegstreiber, means warmonger, because I was working with, quote, both sides. I was working with Croatia and with Serbia on this thing, and Montenegro. You're not allowed to do that. Okay, anyway, this is some kind of idea of the kind of megastructures that could be installed there, and this model is now in Frankfurt, and, it's with the book, and it's kind of funny. The real estate division of the German bank, Deutsche Bank, the biggest bank in Germany, bought 10 copies of the book for its board. And hey, I guess it's pretty soon going to have a German version of this company, I guess. I don't know. Now, let's see. We got, we're just saying, here's a bit of architectural thinking. One of the things that happens when you do basin mappings, you realize, of course, you can identify Italy in this watershed. It's not a very clear drawing, but it's a little sketchy there. But that just identifies ways you partition a country and then show its subsections. But on the left, you see that we're also thinking it was in the urban context within the basin. In this case, the California has a megalopolis going from San Diego to San Francisco, and the eastern seaboard, northeast seaboard, has one going from Boston to Washington. And they're basically, it's curious, you have these two kind of linear cities. Now, I'm moving to the so-called architectural phase. We're actually winding this up now. One of the things that happened in terms of the satellite work is they always wanted us to look at Soviet missile bases and so on. And we did that eventually for CBS. Of course, the news broadcast was totally falsified to say this is Star Wars research. It wasn't. In fact, it was more or less anti-Star Wars research. The point is that we were able, with civilian satellites, to identify and count the dismantling of Soviet bases, and therefore essentially use civilian means to enforce treaty agreements, which is, you're not supposed to do that. And we didn't mean that. That was just Space Force. Now, this civilian initiative, using civilian satellites, also led us to a rather interesting architectural question. If, for example, the structures on the lower right was, okay, here's my angle, I don't know if you agree. I think it kind of looks like an Archipenko. And I think that this is actually meant to house 10,000 people in case of a nuclear war. And these clustered cities, very strongly, tightly kind of megastructural constructions, kind of curious in the middle of the forest. As an urban form, no sprawl, no suburbs, just concentrated city. So that was kind of curious, and each city would have its own, complete information network and complete electronics. So this was a kind of curious architectural discovery. I'd like to go see these places. The fact that you can't, because even though they had a so-called revolution in Russia, I mean, these things are still off limits. You can't go there. It's all still fully armed. Anyway, now we're going to get a little art here, and I'll get into the architectural phase, so-called buildings. I would say that we're not really interested in buildings, we're interested in cities, but we do want to deal with buildings from the point of view, or structures from the point of view of the body. And here's an artist named Carla Schneemann. She's on the list down below. And Carla Schneemann, I think, is an underappreciated American artist, although she's coming back into, shall we say, fashion these days. Her whole angle was really, well, she did very powerful performances. She was all there with people like Klaus Oldenburg and that kind of stuff. And she was always doing these performances about fertility and about, the female fertility power. So she's doing rather dramatic things and taking her clothes off and doing some things with her body and so on. The thing is that she also did some performances involving what she thought to be the basic relationship of the body to terrain, and that was this whole balancing act, as you see sort of on the left, balancing on a rail and working with the fact that you can balance on a certain point, and also balancing by covering two parts of the rail, making an arch. And that, I think you'll see visually, has been manifested, although inadvertently. I didn't know this. I was just sort of having an intuition from my work with Gordon Maddox Clark and these kind of forms where you have a structure that's balancing, counterbalancing, a bit like the body counterbalances, or having a lone linear structure with a kind of arching, but using, again, working against a rail system. And these ideas here are based on the fact that when you stand, you are not rigid like a pillar. You are actually constantly weighing back and forth. This is picked up by some, that's just sort of a view from above. And we also had the idea in terms of lightweight structures of having the counterbalancing structures not be with tension, rigid tension systems, but having very elastic systems. Eve Waterlaus, who's also associated with the company, who was kind of fascinated by the whole question of women's foundations and so on in architecture, she got $10,000 for nothing, $10,000 worth of basically underwear material, and we made all kinds of webbing with it. And she actually did all kinds of various kind of very elastic structures with this stuff. And it then became interesting that this was a very good way of foiling wind, for example. And I know that people like Frey also have worked on lightweight structures with rigid tensile systems. We thought it would be kind of interesting to have this with rigid tents, to have this with very, very elastic material, which could then be replaced maybe. And anyway, we had fantasies of this kind of cities, these kinds of, let's say, hot air systems, suspending canopies. I know we're running out of time here. It's already, well, towards the end of it. So let's just say that this is directly derived from my trip to LA in 1978, which was tied in with research for Gordon Maddox Clark. I should say that the buildings are derived largely from his pieces called splitting, where he would take a house and break it apart, and then of course you have these two unstable halves. When I can always go back if you like, but I'll just say that we'll go back here for a second. This particular structure here was, is derived from the idea of splitting. It was also derived from a need I saw for a large structure by Richard Serra to be suspended. If you've ever seen Richard Serra's work, you realize that the most exciting part about it is the crane. It's the installation and de-installation. The work itself, it's the fact of putting it in. So I said, why not just keep the crane there permanently and make the crane become part of the architecture? So in this case, what you have is you have a central weight, a central disc. There are other models, you can't quite see that disc, but you have a central weight suspended in the middle of the building, and then the rest of it is essentially it's a 360-degree circumferential bascule bridge. And that concept for allowing elevation by playing off weight against weight well, it seemed like it was certainly a rather popular sculptural idea. There are a number of sculptors in that area. We thought, let's make architecture that way. And so you can have lightweight megastructure linear cities with a lot of load off the ground with various countervailing elements. On the right was just a way of trying to reduce wind load. An architectural engineer named, you can find him in your library probably, Giuseppe De Campoli. He did some books for Wiley Inner Science Press on structural engineering. He's gone through all of these drawings, and he says basically they all look pretty sound to him. It's just a question of doing it and also somehow getting around the building code. And the basic idea that has been developed, as this guy who had left, Paul Rudolph, said to me, well, first of all, you have to do it in a country where there's a totally new set of laws, like, say, Yugoslavia. And second of all, you have to not build them as buildings, but build them as either as art pieces or build them as bridges. Or use some other kind of legal code to underwrite this kind of work. What really happened here was in the final years of, well, the final months of Gordon Matta Clark's life, I was sent off to do a lot of research for him on what would be, do you know his work, Matta Clark? You know, he cut up buildings and so on. He was calling himself an architect, not a real architect. He went to Yale Architecture School, dropped out, and went into so-called art. I would just say he was just trying to pursue the architectural logic. But he picked up an idea from Leonidov called Skyhawk, and he picked up on some of the archigram thinking about various balloons and so on, and he basically wanted to create balloon suspended floors, balloon suspended rooms, maybe canopies, walkways. He died, and he never did that. I picked up on it. I did some work with some balloonists here in the LA area, and I realized you have to have a heat source, and this work here, this QB2, is essentially my take, my further development of that. The wind foil system below, which the structural engineer says may work. We have to check it out against a wind tunnel, I guess. And the use, in this case, of a large heat source near the Queensboro Bridge and building a functioning structure. The main point here is that if you take a city, I know this certainly in New York, I think it's probably true here, you know there's a lot of heat, a lot of hot air, a lot of low-grade heat, both wintertime and summertime. And one could use this to suspend lightweight canopies holding up vegetation, allowing for a kind of a canopy of forest over the city, especially if you were to gather low-grade heat from many buildings and conduit it through smokestacks or heat stacks. And that sort of idea, especially if you have a computer to regulate the flow, could allow for an ambiental situation, unlike the present situation of either indoors or outdoors. You don't really have an intermediation between the two. And buildings, therefore, for example, have to stand up much more rigidly to wind stress and so on, wind load. One point there I might observe, and this is what this Giuseppe De Campoli liked. As I said, you can check his books. What he liked in terms of his thinking was that he was always saying the buildings are overbuilt. There's much too rigidity built into them, and it's really very important to have maybe a third of the, easily a third of the weight that they now have. He was looking at the Japanese model a lot in terms of the tremendous flexibility of construction. And the question really now is to use counterweighting techniques, tensile techniques, and other lightweight architecture techniques, plus air, ambiental situations to allow for reduced wind load and then allow for reduced, rigidity of structures and less post and beam stuff, more cantilever stuff. And all with the idea that we can build a city based on the body. On the left is a diagram which appears in black and white in the book. It also appears in a number of other art books. It's a rather famous drawing. That's the crude hand drawing. I don't know how clear that is to you all. Let's just say that I just analyzed standing and then said you can do various things with the process of standing to build counterweighting structures. On the right is another thing that comes out of very precisely running and realizing what happens with your blood vessels and how you pump. And the fantasy here was, this has not been researched with the architectural engineer. I don't know if it would work, but the fantasy here is to build a mass transit system that would be a series of walkways based on aqueducts, either a heavier than air gas or also liquid, that would be pumped, obviously at different speeds, and allow you to go from lane to lane. On top of this waterway would be a kind of belt boat that with obviously grooves or something at the bottom to allow it to be pushed forward. So it's a continuous belt boat being pushed forward by water current, and it imitates blood. And I guess the idea really comes from the fantasy of having cities be places you can run in. With this, of course, you have a bouncing surface, not a rigid surface. I went out for a run this morning in LA. First of all, there's bad air. And second of all, all the concrete is very, very hard. It's not even asphalt. It's very unpleasant. It hurts your feet. And why is this going on? It's not a city for running. I think it's important to build cities that are you can breathe in and you can run in, and you can enjoy really being in space. The architectural vocabulary on the left is Robert Smithson. I've done the lightweight stuff, and I'm going to talk about getting off the ground. As you know, you're in Earthquakeville. The problem we had in Montenegro was that everything in that site, which was about the size of San Francisco Bay, but much more dramatic, I should say, much higher mountains and all that. Everything in that site, said by Wordsworth to be the most beautiful place in Europe, so you hesitate to build architecture. Everything in that site was earthquake dangerous, and there had been, whole towns being wiped out, like 6,000 people dead overnight. It's very funny. People worry about earthquakes here, but in a so-called third world country like Yugoslavia, a 6,000 dead event was not atypical. You had Skopje, you had this town in our bay, only about 2 or 3 years before we got there. And it's funny how in America, the media so acclimatizes us to such catastrophes when, in fact, in other countries, it's much bigger and much more frequent, including the war, of course. Now, the main thing is that in dealing with the earthquake problem there, we were advised by them to work with the hillsides as more stable substrate rather than work in the valley, building the hills, and well, we had a Smithson precedent on that. And on the right, we had an Oppenheim concept, and for some kind of notion of what a city could be. And we just use these concepts to prepare what you saw a little bit in the models. There's a Lewitt version of a drawing, and on the right would be our fantasy of how to lay out the whole city. Namely, set it into the hills with like a linear structure set in the hills like caves. There are other drawings, but I don't have them here, I'm sorry. There are many drawings prepared in Graz. And then also have these kind of lightweight, counterweighted, almost like lunar landing module structures with highway systems coursing across the flatlands, but in every case having very flexible rock and roll type structures on the flatlands and having other structures set into the hills with your various structural elements over the excavated portions of the hillside. That accords with ideas about wedging and cutting into landscape that were pioneered by Heitzer, Di Maria, and Oppenheim. And that idea could be applied in conjunction with satellite monitoring to a site like Skopje. This, on the left, is a model for what to do with Skopje. In detail, there's a lot of new diversion, new river systems, and the right is your kind of satellite monitoring made three-dimensional. Skopje, as you know, is part of Macedonia. It's on the map on the right here. I think, that's our brief pause. There's only a few more images to show. They're not necessary to show. There's more kind of funny stuff. Are there any questions? No. It is now exactly 2 hours since we started. So we could wrap up quickly. I just popped through the last stuff just to talk a bit about mass media, a little Swiss stuff, and that's it. The way we're going to wrap this up is to say that we think that the way to play on this thing, and actually it's under demand now for the Cologne Art Fair, is, there's a lot of propaganda needs. One form of propaganda is the thing called newsroom, which is shown on the left, and that's an architectural tool. It's building a room in which you have all the news brought together. Now, I know about this because we always had all these TV clients and all these newspaper clients, and I think it would be very interesting to develop maybe a container, air freight container, or certain kinds of rooms that could be kind of all-encompassing entertainment centers or information centers involving maps, video, computers, whatever else, and try to figure out the kind of way you could simulate the world in a room so you could get a real heavy dose of information, because it's stupid to read a newspaper alone. I learned this you really get spoiled when you're in media land, because you realize that the way to know what's going on in the world is to just go to NBC and hang out in the newsroom. And so the idea of creating this is done in the gallery, and we had large wall maps on the wall, one of, in this case, basins, the other one of nations, and then we just show all the things that are going on. And you plot historical events against geopolitical space, and you can begin to see a lot of relationships. So that's one idea about how to begin to spread these ideas. It's a architectural tool, I dare say. Another thing is that you use the art world as an instrument for propaganda by playing with the tools. Now, Documenta, I was asked to be in Documenta. I said we didn't do the ocean Earth idea of the Albania-LA comparison based on these maps here. We did rather, I did flags, and I put the flags up. I don't have the flags here to show you, but the German flag was based on the thing on the left, which I just took a slogan from Germany called "Alle Dinge sind drei," means all good things, alle gute Dinge sind drei, all good things come in three parts. Well, North Sea, Baltic Sea, Black Sea, basta. And it means that what's very curious is that image pretty much achieves most of Hitler's fantasies, as has been told to me quite frequently in Austria, but does it in three parts. So, well, you know, Charlemagne has to cut it up. You don't have a monolith, you have a breakup. On the right is a poster campaign that was funded by the Viennese government in the subway system, in this case on the Donau Insel, which is the island on the Donau River, the Danube. And it was to promote a new country, the Black Sea Basin, as an integrity with its own pollution problems, its own soil system and so on, its Chernobyl and so on. And to present this as Heimaten, which is not a German word, it's based on Heimat. And I was making a joke here because in German, which they speak also in Austria, and much of that is the old Austrian Empire, the word Heimat means homeland, but the German language does not allow for the notion of homelands. You can't have a plural, it's not possible. And I said, well, you can have a homelands if it's a single ocean basin, so you can have many nations inside the ocean basin. And that's just a way of propagandizing and also making fun of a language which doesn't allow for thinking about the other culture very well. On the left is an installation in Munich funded by probably the richest man in Austria. He's from the head of the Volkswagen company, and he provided this big space and had big parties, and he was always called the king of art. And he was very decadent, and they had to play along with his lifestyle, live in his castle. But the point is that you can see a little bit the tracery. This is how I divided Europe into ocean basins, the exterior basin and the interior basin. One is Mediterranean, the other one's the North Atlantic. And you can see a bit of the European flag. Again, I don't have the slides for that, but I played a joke on the European flag and made it into, that's what was shown in Documenta. The funniest story about that, and then of course here in France was an installation of a whole room called the Salle du Monde. It became a coffee house, and it's kind of funny because you could see the whole world all cut up in these ocean basins. Now, the reason why this is interesting is that you have now a new Swiss flag based on the same idea. It's just a joke, ha ha ha, and I don't really mean it, but I guess I do kind of mean it. The funny thing is that this was shown in Zurich at the City Waste Treatment Center when they sponsored the big show. It's quite famous show. It's got a lot of art reviews. And this flag, which was in front of the highway, has led now to a demand for production of 10,000 copies for sale to motorists, so that there is a chance to broadcast an idea and make people begin to think about the soil rather than simply nation states that we have been only used to due to the prior ideas of garden and fortress, the shape of France. This maybe Swiss future would be dealing with, of course, the current need, very acute in Switzerland, to change the fuel base so there's no more destruction of the forest and of the mountains. That's the end of my story. I can always talk about the European map and the European football field, but I think you've heard everything. Thanks. I can use a drink right now. We will be, oh, it doesn't hear it.